Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come in the 10th chapter in the book of Psalms. And the reading of any Psalms really begins with the title. So, quite often in the title, the author is identified, the one to whom the writing and composition was attributed. And we also read of certain melodies and musical instruments, and sometimes we read historical context for which it came about. But in the 10th, we actually have a blank slate. It's just the reading of it begins with the opening verse, but before we read that and comment on it, we just want to establish the momentum that begins in the 9th chapter. Israel was surrounded by enemies, and these enemies were notoriously wicked people, so much so that the chosen people were settled to, the promised land was chosen for the chosen people on account of the abominable religious practice of many of these nations, and so the temptation was always there for their influence to seep in to their covenant community. But their own covenant community, as we read in the 10th chapter, was not immune from sin and iniquity, in spite of having the covenant and Yahweh and a righteous king like David, who is the author of the 9th and 11th Psalm, so he may or may not have written this one. They did not make the most out of their advantages and blessings and benefits. They lived in a manner that was indistinct from the most sunken of heathens, and the way they do that is they eliminate Elohim altogether from their minds, because once he's there, you think you have automatic license to do whatever you want, to do whatever you will, with no consequences, either here or now or forever in the eternal realm. And so the author of this psalm describes wicked people, who they are, what they do, what motivates them, and what the way they think, because as we think will determine our behavior. So if we think wicked thoughts, we will do wicked deeds. If we think upright thoughts, we will do good deeds. So the opening verse reads, "Why do you stand afar, O Yahweh, hiding in times of distress?" Now, you can interpret this in a lot of ways. One way is faithless, doubtful. Another way is honest. So the psalmist always express whatever's on their mind, and the fact is that there's nothing unnatural about the presence of doubt in our prayers. We are to bring our doubts to Yahweh and question out loud the things which perplex us, because we cannot receive an answer unless we ask the question. And this is the juxt of the book of Habakkuk, and it's also embedded in here. It's better to doubt out loud than to harbor unbelief in silence, because if we stifle our doubts, we can never get the answer. If we deny our doubts, it does not make them any less real. So his particular doubt at this moment in time was that he seemed to turn a blind eye and be nowhere near the wickedness which was all around the psalmist. In arrogance, the wicked hotly pursues the poor. They are caught by the schemes which they devised. So it's an act of arrogance which compels one to exploit the poor. They think they have no protector. They think they have no legal courses, but those who are without resources and protection in this life are regarded as treasures and belong to Yahweh. His love and concern, it certainly extends to the vulnerable, the outcast, and the oppressed of society. So poor make easy pickings for a lot of wicked and arrogant people. But the sword that they swing, the metaphorical sword they swing on them, will be turned on them. The trap that they lay for them, their own foot will set in it. So you reap what you sow. And because they had pigged out on bullying and exploiting the poor, eventually and inevitably they would fall trapped to their own traps that they had devised, their own schemes. For the wicked boasted of his cravings, and the greedy one cursed and despised Yahweh. So there's two types of people: wicked, which is a more general term, and greedy, which is a specific type of wicked. The wicked are arrogant and proud. They boast of their appetites and their satisfactions, because that's what wicked people do. Foolishness, by its very nature, is self-advertising and self-proclaiming, whereas wisdom and humility is content to keep itself to oneself. It has no need to make itself known until it's absolutely necessary. And greedy one, they are cursed. There's a few commandments against stealing and coveting. These are both related to greed, and they are cursed and despised. They are cursed, and they curse and despise Yahweh, and because they do so, they are cursed and despised by Him. So once more, you do reap what you sow. In the pride of his face, the wicked does not seek. In all his thoughts, there is no Elohim. So no matter where they are, no matter what they're doing, Elohim is nowhere on their mind. And that is why they do what they do and are what they are, because you cannot approach or understand divinity if you approach it with an attitude of pride or arrogance or wickedness. And the wicked flees from the pursuit of the knowledge of divinity because it'll shatter his delusions and expose his hollow, hypocritical life for what it is. So it's far easier to persist in wickedness and get away with it, even though there's no getting away with it in the long run, when you eliminate altogether even the idea of the existence of deity, because without supreme higher power to whom we have to answer for the life we lived one day, we can live life as we please. We think we can, but we're in for a rude awakening when we do that and realize there are eternal consequences for our mortal probationary period. His ways are always prosperous. Your judgments are on high, out of his sights. He snorts at all his adversaries. So the prosperity of the wicked is a common lament or complaint amongst the psalmists, most famously in Asaph's 73rd Psalm. But then he goes to the temple, and his consternation and the chaos and confusion in his mind is eliminated when he realizes the end of these people. So the affliction of the comforted and the comforting of the affliction is one of the paradoxical summaries of the prophetic messages. So even though the people who are wise in the ways of the world are going to prosper at the expense of the righteous, their investment is not going to pay eternal dividends. And he's also comparing the loftiness of his own justice, his own judgment, and his own wisdom, which are seemingly beyond the worldly or cardly man who, without looking above him, he snorts at his adversaries in front of and around him. He has said in his heart, I shall not be moved. From generation to generation, never be an evil. So the wicked or evil person who says such a thing is far removed from reality. They think they can keep going their own way, doing their own thing, living the way they're living, and chart their own course, finish their own race, and enter into their own imagined glory, which is hell. And his mouth is filled with cursings and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is trouble and wickedness. The words of one's mouth and tongue are an accurate reflection of their inner character. So if the person's speech or manner of speaking is prolific with cursings, profanity, lies, deceptions, and are designed to exalt himself at the expense of others, that's how we can interpret oppression. That is just the way they are, and the way they think is the way they talk, and the way they act is the way they think. So everything in the final analysis revolves around and springs from the way we think. Hence, we must orient our thoughts to godliness if we want to live godly lives. He sits in the hiding places of the village. In the secret places, he murders the innocents. His eyes are on the lookout for the helpless. So murder is not a one-time thing for this particular caricature of a wicked person. He is always watching and always waiting for the next available opportunity to kill, and he conceals himself in obscurity in the hiding places of the villages to do what he does. There's no motive listed or even remotely rational reason to live a life like that, but some people are inclined that way. He lies in wait in a secret place as a lion in the den. He lies in wait to catch the poor. He catches the poor, drawing him into his net. So the wicked person who oppresses a fellow human is a lot of his means and methods are comparable to that of a hunter, be it a lion or a fisherman who used nets. They didn't have hooks back then, they used nets. So they would stalk a prey, spring a trap, and eat their catch. And so what they were doing was none too dissimilar from that which a lion does, which is the most magnificent physical creature in creation as measured by strength and confrontation, and also fishing nets. They would catch poor as a fisherman catches fish and do what they would with them from there. And he crouches, he lies low, and the helpless falls under his strength. So he's physically positioning himself for the most advantageous front to spring his trap. It demands concealment until the moment is right when he can emerge and do what he does and cut them into pieces or enslave them or oppress them in any way, shape, and form. And the helpless are the ones who are vulnerable to his traps and designs because they are without external resources. He says in his heart, El has forgotten, he has hidden his face, he shall never see. So they have an idea of the existence of a deity, but they convince themselves through cognitive dissonance, because they keep getting away with their evil, that Yahweh has turned a blind eye in the heavens and he can get a free pass. He has a hall pass of sorts to do whatever he wants without fear of notice or punishment or retribution. And so once we eliminate even the idea or the existence of God in our minds, we have no moral restraints to contain our wicked inclinations, because we have no fear of consequence of eternal judgment. But just because we don't have fear doesn't mean that we shouldn't, because we're divorcing ourselves from the reality with the fiction, which allows us to persist in our own wicked ways and reap the consequences of which we didn't even calculate, because we were convinced that there was no deity to answer to at the end of this life. Arise, O Yahweh, O El, lift up your hand. Do not forget the lowly ones. So at this point in the prayer, he is praying for Yahweh to rise and be known and intervene dramatically on behalf of the lowly ones. These are the vulnerable, the outcast, and the oppressed, the dregs of society who were being exploited, and the covenant which governed their community and everyone in it had a special concern for the widows, the orphans, and the homeless. But human nature being human nature, the covenant could not alter human nature, and so the Israelite society was much like any other in that the rich exploited the poor, and this was something from top to bottom and all around their society. Why do the wicked scorn Elohim? He has said in his heart, it is not required. So he's asking, why do the wicked scorn Elohim? Now, if they didn't scorn Elohim, they wouldn't be wicked. So it's really a rhetorical and redundant question, because once we are scorning Elohim, once we are replacing him with ourselves for all effect, we imagine ourselves to be the master of our own universes, our own private fiefdoms of deity, and they wouldn't ask this question if they thought that there would be retribution required for the injury they had inflicted so indifferently on others. You have seen it, for you observe trouble and grief. To repay with your hand, the poor commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. So he is all-seeing and all-knowing, and nothing escapes him. And for 400 years, he allowed his chosen people to, or 430, maybe even closer, he allowed his chosen people to wallow in Egyptian bondage, but their cries up to him, he had noticed them, and finally he was prompted into action. This was liberated them, and so the psalmist is also asking him to... There's obvious inequality and oppression, not quite like that of the Egyptian slave system society, but enough for him to want him to take notice and take action of the thing, which is an abomination of his sight, and he's assuring them of the loyalty of the poor who commit themselves to him, largely because they don't have any resources or friends or protectors, so they have nowhere else to turn. But from a blank slate is almost a more pure outcome. And he is the helper of the fatherless, so the orphans and the widows are assured of his concern, even if the society around them does not pay any mind to their welfare. He very much does, and their eternal welfare. Break the arms of the wicked and evil one. Search out his wickedness that would not be found out. So he's asking him to inflict physical injury on the wicked. This is an imprecatory prayer, which is a prayer for a curse to befall amongst God's enemies or his own anointed, and or any wicked person meriting and judgment. And these were a lot more common in the Old Testament than the New, because the Old Covenant community of Israel was national in charter. Hence the principles of the principles of retaliation were permitted for nation states and individuals within that nation state. But the New Covenant community is not national in charter, it is pan-national, and as such we are free, we are absolved of the need to retaliate when provoked violently. And the sinner takes great lengths to conceal his wickedness, but there are a few of whom we read who actually boast in their wickedness. And this reminds me of a Shout Your Abortion campaign, which has the endorsement of no less than Oprah Winfrey, which is encouraging women who should be ashamed of the fact that they killed their own child to publicly and proudly proclaim it. But more to the point of the passage, there is no sin which can remain hidden. You can hide it from the world. You can even hide it for yourself. You can place it in the furthest corner of your heart and mind, so much so that you may live the rest of your life without remembering it, but it will be found out. Numbers 32:23, your sin will find you out, if not in this lifetime, certainly in the next, and there's no escaping that. There's no array around that, so there's no sense in tricking yourself that there is either an escape or a way to circumvent the reaping the consequences of the sin you have sown. Yahweh is king forever and ever. The Gentiles shall perish from his land. So his sovereignty and his rulership is eternal. It is without limit. It is without beginning and without end. And the Gentile nations who vie among themselves for the jockeying for the top position of the geopolitical pecking order are in a species of vanity, because none of it's going to last. Their temporal kingdoms are as temporary as his heavenly one is eternal, and they can only rise and flourish and prosper by his providential grace. Yahweh, you have heard the desire of the lowly ones. You prepare their heart. You incline your ear. So he's saying that there's no way he doesn't notice those who pray the loudest, and those who pray the loudest are the ones who need it most. These would be the poor people who would have been subjected to pains and privations which the rich knew not of, and that would have increased their reliance and inclination to turn to the Redeemer and the one who can mediate their ails and ills. And he prepares their heart through adversity and inclines their ear also through adversity, to defend the fatherless and the downtrodden, so that the man who is of the earth no longer oppresses. So all this could be avoided if worldly men didn't oppress. Unfortunately and tragically, human nature is what human nature is. Neither the law of Moses nor the covenant of Israel could alter human nature, but we do have the promise of the transformation which comes in the new covenant in the form of Elohim, in the form of his Son who became flesh and walked among us, and he can change the human nature that the law can't, But even while we are around human nature, which is inclined and oriented and abounds in sin, we can always pray for the Father in heaven to alleviate their ails, and we can even identify with a lot of them. So it's not inappropriate to pray for your own needs when you are oppressed or injured, but we should always be not so selfish as to orient the bulk of our prayers to. We should give the bulk of our prayers and attentions to those who really need it most. But that's a delicate balancing act, and one that can be honed through discipline and diligence. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned till next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.